Aloha! You have made port at Renegade Files your destination for paranormal adventures, unsolved mysteries, and unusual culture. I'm your host, Lex Gordon, broadcasting from the Jungleville Outpost, deep in the uncharted tropics. This is Renegade Files episode 135. Tiki culture, cargo cults, and mid-century escapism. When we think about Tiki culture, certain images immediately come to mind. Bamboo bars, carved idols, Hawaiian shirts, and flaming drinks. This is a tale that begins before World War II, when a few adventurous entrepreneurs began creating fantasy versions of Polynesia. Then the war sent millions of American servicemen into the Pacific, where they encountered tropical islands, unfamiliar cultures, and ways of life that seemed worlds away from the America they had left behind. When they came home, they brought some of that fascination with them. Tiki exploded into pop culture across the nation. And just as Americans encountered the cultures of the Pacific Islanders were also encountering the Western world, sometimes with extraordinary results. The so-called cargo cults happened when remote island cultures suddenly encountered American military technology and seemingly unimaginable material abundance. On this episode, we'll follow Tiki from its pre-war beginnings through World War II, the suburban boom, Hollywood, and the great Polynesian palaces of Tiki's golden age. We'll explore its decline, its revival, and why nearly a century after the first Tiki bars appeared, people are still building imaginary tropical worlds of their own to briefly escape the ordinary and imagine another way of life. So join me now, and together, we'll explore the unlikely unfolding of Tiki culture, cargo cults, and mid-century escapism. You can find all things Renegade Files at therenegadefiles.com, your one-stop shop for merchandise, bonus episodes, the RFA agency on Patreon, and more. Just visit therenegadefiles.com. Part 1. The South Pacific. In the early 1940s, millions of young Americans found themselves transported farther from home than they had ever imagined. They came from farms in Iowa, factory towns in Pennsylvania, neighborhoods in the big cities, and small communities across America. Many had never traveled outside of their own state. Then the Second World War sent them across an ocean and into an immense island world, stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific. American servicemen passed through Hawaii, Samoa, Fiji, the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the Philippines, and hundreds of other smaller islands. They encountered tropical landscapes that seemed to be straight out of an old Hollywood movie. They saw volcanic mountains covered in dense vegetation, coral reefs under sparkling water, palm tree-lined beaches, exotic foods and music, open-air villages, and indigenous cultures with traditions very different from anything they had ever seen. Of course, the Pacific War itself was anything but paradise. Many of the forces involved experienced brutal combat, disease, isolation, extreme weather. All of the horrors of war were also a part of everyday life. The romantic image of the South Pacific that later emerged in American popular culture should never be confused with the reality of fighting a war there. But millions of Americans had now seen the Pacific Islands firsthand, including servicemen stationed far from any combat zone. Some of them spent months and even years living on the islands with the people and their cultures. When the war ended in 1945, these servicemen brought pieces of that world home with them. Some returned with photographs and carvings, shells, and other island souvenirs, and others remembered island music, tropical clothing, unfamiliar foods, beach gatherings, and evenings spent under the palm trees 1,000 miles from home. They told stories about places with names that suddenly became part of the American vocabulary: Bora Bora, Samoa, Fiji. One veteran who carried the Pacific home in a particularly influential way was James A. Michener. Michener served as a U.S. Navy lieutenant, and he traveled through the South Pacific during the war, and drawing upon partly those experiences, he published Tales of the South Pacific in 1947. This was a fictional collection of interconnected stories about servicemen, nurses, islanders, romance, danger, and everyday life during the war in the South Pacific, and that book won the 1948 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Then, Rodgers and Hammerstein adapted Michener's stories into the Broadway musical South Pacific, which opened in 1949 and became a cultural phenomenon. 9 years later, the 1958 film adaptation of South Pacific carried those images across the rest of the country. For millions of Americans, Michener's book, the musical and film that followed, made the romance, adventure, beauty, and exoticism of the South Pacific a tantalizing fantasy. Suddenly, the possibility of living beyond the everyday routines was creeping into the structured life of the mid-century. But the media phenomenon of South Pacific wasn't the first glimpse of that world. The groundwork for the fantasy had already been stoked as far back as 1933, when a young adventurer named Ernest Raymond Gant, who was better known as Don Beach, opened a small bar in Hollywood. That bar became Don the Beachcomber. At his bar, Don Beach combined rum cocktails and nautical decor into an immersive fantasy environment. A few years after that, but still before the war, a man named Victor Bergeron transformed his own Oakland bar into Trader Vic's, which also served up a Polynesian-themed dining and drinking experience. Both of these businesses became vastly influential on what would become America's Tiki culture, but at their beginning, their vibe was a novelty experienced by a relatively limited number of people. But by the time the war ended, millions of American military personnel had served somewhere in the vast Pacific theater. They had seen real tropical islands and real Pacific cultures, although their experiences varied enormously depending on exactly where they had served. When they returned to a rapidly growing and increasingly prosperous United States, the commercial fantasy created by places like Don the Beachcomber and Trader Vic's suddenly had a much larger audience. And while Americans were returning home with their own memories and interpretations of the Pacific, something equally fascinating had happened in the islands, also as a result of the war moving through that area. Across parts of Melanesia, particularly in places like New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, local populations had witnessed the sudden arrival of industrial warfare on a scale that was almost impossible for them to comprehend. Airfields appeared where there had been jungle. Ships arrived carrying mountains of supplies. Parachutes descended from the sky, loaded with crates of canned food, clothing, medicine, and even jeeps. Roads and military installations were constructed with astonishing speed. Thousands of American servicemen appeared along with a vast logistical system of almost endless quantity from somewhere beyond the horizon. For the island communities, the scale and wonder of this arrival was extraordinary. Then the war ended, the bases were abandoned, the airfields became quiet, and the troops vanished. Anthropologists and colonial observers began documenting religious and social movements that Western writers grouped under a strange and controversial label: cargo cults. Some involved prophecies that ancestors or supernatural powers would deliver wealth and manufactured goods. Some incorporated military imagery, marching, flags, or elements borrowed from the astonishing machinery of the war. The popular story would eventually become much simpler. Islanders saw American airplanes bring cargo. They built imitation airfields and hoped that the airplanes would return. The real history is considerably more complicated, and as we travel through the strange world of American Tiki culture, we're going to look into a few of these cargo cult stories along the way, because the war in the Pacific changed the people on both sides of this extraordinary cultural encounter in ways that neither fully understood at the time. Part 2. From War to the Suburbs. When the Second World War ended in 1945, more than 12 million Americans were serving in the armed forces. Over the next few years, most of them came home and began the enormous process of returning to civilian life. The GI Bill helped millions of veterans attend college, get job training, and buy homes with government-backed loans. The economy expanded and marriages surged, and so did the birth rate. In the decades that followed, more than 76 million babies were born in the US, creating the generation we now call the baby boomers. Millions of young families moved into rapidly expanding suburbs as the post-war American dream took shape. By the 1950s, that dream was becoming possible for more people than ever before. Televisions appeared in living rooms, the supermarkets grew larger, new highways connected expanding areas, and families had more disposable income to spend on recreation and entertainment. But all that prosperity came with a certain amount of conformity. New suburban neighborhoods were filled with houses that all looked the same. Corporate culture expanded, and the image of the respectable businessman in a gray suit became a symbol of dignity. Social expectations around things like marriage, family, work, and sexuality remained fairly frigid. And living inside this increasingly organized American world was a generation that, during the war, had traveled the world. Some of them had come home with a taste for something a little more exotic. This was the perfect environment for the culture of Tiki to grow. The Polynesian-themed restaurants that had appeared before the war now found a much larger audience. Don Beach expanded Don the Beachcomber, while Victor Bergeron's Trader Vic's grew into an increasingly successful business. Bergeron also claimed to have invented the Mai Tai cocktail at his Oakland restaurant in 1944, creating a drink that became synonymous with Tiki culture. During the 1950s and early 60s, the home bar became a popular feature of American entertaining. Some were just a simple liquor cabinet, but people who embraced the Polynesian craze could turn an ordinary room into their own private tropical hideaway. Bamboo and rattan furniture appeared alongside carved wooden figures. Fishing nets, glass floats, shells, and tropical plants were lit with colorful lights. Hawaiian music provided the soundtrack, while increasingly elaborate rum cocktails completed the atmosphere. A basement in Ohio could suddenly feel very far from the subdivision outside. Then that idea moved into the backyard. Drawing on Hawaiian traditions and the beach parties servicemen had seen in the South Pacific, the backyard luau became a suburban party phenomenon. Hosts decorated patios with torches and tropical flowers. Guests wore Hawaiian shirts and colorful dresses. Pineapples, smoking grills, tropical drinks, and vaguely Polynesian decorations transformed an ordinary Saturday night cookout into something that felt exotic. The authenticity was often questionable. An American Tiki style freely mixed Hawaiian, Polynesian, Melanesian, Asian, nautical, and completely invented imagery into one imaginary tropical world. Right at the height of the trend, we got the TV show Gilligan's Island, which aired 3 original seasons from September 1964 to April 1967. The show was preposterous but also harmless fun, and once again, it put palm fronds and Hollywood set decoration ideas of the South Seas directly into people's living rooms once a week. Gilligan's Island wasn't meant to be realistic, so it fit right in with the overall Tiki genre. authenticity wasn't really what most people were looking for. They just liked the atmosphere, so they made it however they could. The home tiki bar or backyard luau offered something that fit perfectly into post-war American life because it allowed people to enjoy the security and prosperity they had worked for while temporarily escaping the routines that came with it. You could spend the day commuting to an office, mowing the lawn, paying the bills, and living a respectable suburban life. Then invite some friends to come over on a Saturday night, break out the Hawaiian shirts, put on some tropical music, and mix up some rum punch to serve in tiki head ceramic mugs. Light a few bamboo torches, and suddenly the backyard became a private island somewhere in an imaginary South Pacific. You didn't have to leave suburbia to escape it for a while. You could build Polynesia in your basement, on your patio, or poolside, and tiki escapism spread across America. Tap follow real quick wherever you're listening to stay connected and to help the show grow. Part 3. Sex, skin, rum, and going native. Long before the tiki craze reached suburban America, the South Pacific had occupied a special place in Western imagination. European explorers and writers had been describing Polynesia as an exotic paradise since the voyages of Captain James Cook in the 1700s. Stories returned to Europe about beautiful islands, warm weather, abundant food, unfamiliar customs, and cultures that appeared to have a very different attitude about clothing, sexuality, and social behavior. Over the generations that followed, fact mixed freely with exaggeration, and by the 20th century, Hollywood inherited that image and ran with it. The fictional South Pacific became a place of palm trees, waterfalls, grass skirts, bare skin, and people living beneath the tropical sun. Navy sailors fell in love with the beautiful Polynesian women, travelers abandoned their responsibilities, people wore less clothing, drank more freely, and lived outdoors. Eventually, the fantasy was referred to by the popular moniker of, quote, going native. And in mid-century parlance, that expression took on a decidedly, let's just say, enthusiastically romantic tone. It meant pulling off the daily necktie, trading the business suit for a Hawaiian shirt and a Mai Tai, forgetting the rules and going to the islands for a night. Hawaii and the South Pacific were becoming associated with romance and sensuality at exactly the same time that mainstream America began to rebel against strict expectations regarding sexuality. This was the era of the Hollywood production code, when movies operated under detailed rules governing what could be shown on screen. TV shows depicted married couples sleeping in separate beds. Respectable middle-class culture emphasized family, proper appearances, clearly defined social roles, and conservative public attitudes towards sexuality. But then Saturday night would arrive and somebody could throw a luau. Tiki culture created a small loophole in the rules of proper society. The husband could cook over an open fire, while the wife could put on a colorful sarong, a bikini top, and a flower behind her ear. The neighbors came over dressed for the islands, and suddenly the same backyard where the kids had played that afternoon became an adults-only beach bash. There was an unmistakable flirtatious quality to all of this. The whole visual language of Tiki encouraged it. Bare shoulders, suntans, swimming pools, tropical flowers, exotic clothing, dancing, colored lights, and drinks that contained enough rum to make everyone considerably less concerned with proper suburban etiquette. The zombie cocktail had a reputation for being dangerously potent, but without the harsh warning of strong liquor. The scorpion was often served communally in a large bowl with long straws, turning the simple act of having a drink into something playful and intimate. These drinks weren't the bourbon you quietly sipped while discussing the mortgage. They were tropical fuel for a night of debauchery. And for women in particular, the tropical fantasy offered an interesting temporary departure from the carefully managed image of the respectable 1950s housewife. Late 50s and even early 60s society expected married women to be proper and in control. But at a backyard luau, they could wear something more revealing. Dance barefoot by the pool, drink a tropical treat, and be flirtatious. The Tiki party provided just enough exotic fantasy to make the whole thing seem harmless. Everyone was playing a role. That was part of what made it permissible. A sarong and a bikini top was a costume for the party, and a strong rum drink was just part of the theme. Dancing barefoot beside someone else's husband wasn't scandalous. Everyone was pretending they were at a luau, and the suggestion that something slightly naughty might happen was often more important than whether anything actually did. Most suburban tiki parties weren't secret swinger gatherings. Most of these people went home afterward, woke up in the morning, made coffee, went to work, and returned to ordinary life. But something interesting was happening. Americans were becoming more comfortable showing skin, drinking socially in mixed company, talking about sex, flirting openly. And I know it sounds weird, but vacationing without children, and treating adult pleasures as something that could be pursued simply because they were fun. Looking back on it now, we see this as a prelude to the full sexual revolution of the 1960s. The birth control pill would be approved by the FDA in 1960. Playboy, first published in 1953, was already challenging older ideas about sexuality, and the sophisticated American lifestyle began to emerge. Hollywood's production code started to weaken. Attitudes toward dating and marriage and clothing and divorce and sex were starting to change. But tiki culture existed right in that tantalizing transitional moment. It gave mid-century Americans a way to dip their toes into a more permissive world without completely leaving their old world behind. For one Saturday night, everyone could go native, and on Monday morning, put their clothes back on, straighten their ties, and go back to work. And while Americans were creating their own fantasy version of the Pacific, a very different cultural movement was taking place on the island of Tanna, in what is today the nation of Vanuatu. It was one of the first and most enduring of what has been called the cargo cults. This was the John Frum movement, John F-R-U-M, Frum. In Tanna, and on nearby larger islands, military installations had appeared almost overnight with the war. And with them came airstrips, planes, food, and supplies that amazed the locals who helped clear the land and load and unload the cargo. Aircraft arrived loaded with seemingly endless quantities of food, vehicles, radios, medicine, clothing, and machinery. After the war, when most of the gear vanished as quickly as it had arrived, John Frum was depicted as an American World War II serviceman who would someday return with wealth and prosperity for the people if they idolized him. Followers raised American flags and performed ceremonial military-style drills. Even today, February 15th is observed as John Frum Day by some followers on Tanna. The movement was influenced by earlier worship of Kara Paramun, a god associated with Mount Tucosmera. The exact details of this cult are hazy, but one interpretation tells us that the figure John Frum would come back to sweep away the white colonials inhabiting the island and return all their riches to the islands. In other versions, it was a native man named Manahivi who used the alias John Frum who would do all of this. Others say that John Frum was a spirit induced by the psychoactive plant kava, and that he was a manifestation of Kara Paramun who would return, banish all the missionaries, return the local islands to the people, and restore things to the power of the old gods. As you can see, This cargo cult is a complex mix of ideas influenced by the arrival and departure of the modern goods and machinery of war, but also by the older traditions of the islands. It could be said that those trappings coming and then departing became a metaphor for the islanders' hopes that the missionaries and the colonial imperialists would vanish in the same way. In the 1990s, there were reportedly over 5,000 members of the John Frum movement. However, belief in John Frum is in drastic decline. As of 2022, there are fewer than 500 practitioners. Currently, only the village of Lamakara is faithful to the John Frum faith. The rest of the island of Tanna has been mostly converted by Christian missionaries. The evolution of the John Frum cargo cult can be viewed as one of a two-sided cultural exchange that was created by the war. Americans took pieces of Pacific Island culture home and transformed them into a fantasy of tropical freedom. On Tanna, pieces of American military culture were absorbed into a vision of prosperity, independence, and a better world to come. So both cultures borrowed from the ones they encountered, and changed their own traditions in light of the new ideas and images. It's fascinating when you look at it in that way. To dive deeper into the world of Renegade Files, join Renegade Files agency on Patreon and become an RFA agent today. You can check out our Patreon page for free at patreon.com/renegadefiles to get bonus episodes and days of other cool content. Thank you so much if you're an RFA agent already. You make the show possible. Part 4. America expands its imaginary Polynesia. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Tiki culture was everywhere. What had started with a growing number of backyard Tiki parties had grown into a national craze. Tiki bars and Polynesian restaurants appeared across the country. The original Trader Vic's expanded into other cities like San Francisco, Beverly Hills, Chicago, and New York, eventually becoming an international chain. In Fort Lauderdale, Florida, down in my neck of the woods in the uncharted tropics, the Mai Kai opened in 1956 as a complete Polynesian experience with thatched roofs, waterfalls, tropical gardens, exotic cocktails, and dining rooms themed around different islands of the Pacific. The Mai Kai had streams outside with wooden footbridges and an indoor lagoon with dockside seating, all lit with different colored lights. The central showpiece was a thatched stage where performers in grass skirts and coconut bras would perform hula dances and fire spinning shows every night. Outside might be a parking lot beside a busy highway, but step inside and you were surrounded by waterfalls, jungle plants, mysterious lightings, and bartenders mixing drinks with orchid garnishes served in skulls and tiki idol mugs. The Mai Kai became one of the grand temples of American tiki culture. It opened in '56, and in 2015 it was named the best tiki bar in the world by the tiki fan group called Tiki. It's said to be the last restaurant in existence to serve the original drink recipes of Don the Beachcomber, and it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It closed after hurricane and flood damages in 2020 and eventually underwent a $20 million renovation and reopened in 2024. Another tiki destination that must be mentioned is Tiki Gardens in St. Petersburg Beach. In the late 1960s, on 12 acres, a married couple from South Carolina, Frank and Joe Byers, created what could almost be called a tiki theme park. They dug a lake, connected it with canals to artificial waterfalls and little rock pools, all filled with goldfish. They crossed the canals with wooden bridges, and Tiki Gardens attracted up to 500,000 annual visitors. You could take a cruise on the lake in a thatch-roofed pontoon boat, The pontoon boat had like a plywood front and back on it to make it look like a Hawaiian sort of outrigger canoe. Although with the obvious metal and aluminum support and rest of the pontoon boat kind of around it. Kitschy looking, right? You could stroll the garden pathways, look at exotic plants, wonder at giant Easter Island style stone heads, and these were made out of chicken wire and plaster. But they did look pretty cool. There were live peacocks, monkeys, and parrots. You could dine in the restaurant and shop in multiple gift shops. I think there were 6 different gift shops there. The highlight of each day was the lighting of the Tiki torches, which was a ceremony performed at sunset with girls in grass skirts and fire-twirling, muscle-bound men in sarongs. I've read that Frank was constantly in trouble with his wife Jo for flirting and sneaking around the gardens with the young female employees who dressed in colorful, very short sarongs and bikini tops. They worked in the gift shops as servers in Trader Frank's, which was the restaurant, and they were otherwise hired to simply populate and decorate the paths and bridges of the gardens. These young ladies were affectionately called the Wahinis, and every time the wife Jo turned around, it seemed like Frank had hired another beautiful young Wahini. Tiki Gardens lasted until 1988, and it's now a beach park access and named for the old resort, but most of the evidence of the original Tiki Gardens is gone. Only the overgrown canals and lake remain, and they're surrounded by some of the persistent tropical palms and a crumbling statue or two overgrown in the brush. I was able to find a recording of a record that was sold in one of the Tiki Gardens gift shops. Let's listen to a few minutes as our host, Frank Byers, invites guests to the nightly lighting of the torches ceremony.
Aloha, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's now twilight time here at Tiki Gardens, and again, it's time for torch lighting. So all of you folks in the various shops, if you'd care to join with us in our ceremony, if you'll kindly step out into the little garden, we're about to begin. Now, the peacocks have come over. They're perched atop the various buildings. You can hear them in the background. So to get you in the mood for your trip to the South Sea Islands, here's Ernie playing for you a medley of beautiful Hawaiian tunes on the Wurlitzer. And here's Ernie. Aloha in Hawaiian means hello, goodbye, much love and affection. Here at Tiki Gardens, we love it. Aloha. And that ends our organ serenade for the evening. And again, it's deep twilight here in Tiki Gardens and time for torch lighting. This is an age-old ceremony passed on down from the days of the kings. It was a method the monarch used to call the subjects to the evening's festivities, or the luau as we know it today. First, the trumpeter goes forth and blows 3 mighty blasts to the ocean and 3 to the mountains. Then the natives gather in the courtyard, all the wahinis and connies. First, the area has to be lighted. Now tonight, lighting the torches, Lilani, Tarito, and Malia. So now, without further ado, let's on with the ceremony.
Wonderful. I saw a copy of that old record, which is called Exotic Sounds of Tiki Gardens, for sale on a vinyl site for $800. So if you have one, Lucky you. You can listen to that entire recording, linked in all of its cheesy glory, plus see tons of excellent pictures of Tiki Gardens, the Mai Kai, and other Tiki memorabilia and images from the peak Tiki era just by signing up for your free week at patreon.com/renegadefiles, or go through the link on our Patreon page at therenegadefiles.com. Go get them. So at the same time as Tiki Gardens and the original Mai Kai was opening, other Tiki restaurants and bars started cropping up. Then motels, bowling alleys, and apartment complexes adopted this look. Even Disney World in Orlando, Florida built the Polynesian Hotel with a famous volcanic rock and tropical plant centerpiece in the lobby, and an endless soundtrack of Tiki music playing through hidden speakers across the grounds. Then in 1963, Disney opened the Enchanted Tiki Room in both California's Disneyland and Florida's Disney World, where mechanical tropical birds, flowers, and carved figures came to life to perform an immersive Polynesian fantasy. And the Tiki-themed destination restaurant or bar has been repeated across the entire country. The early days of Tiki culture even developed its own original soundtrack. Composer Les Baxter helped establish a style of lush orchestral music inspired by imagined faraway places with his 1951 album Ritual of the Savage. A few years later, pianist Martin Denny began performing at the famous Hawaiian Village Resort in Honolulu. During one performance, Denny and his musicians heard frogs croaking loudly in a landscaped pond near the bandstand. The musicians began imitating the sounds as a joke, adding bird calls and other jungle noises to the music, and audiences loved it. That moment inspired Denny's 1957 album Exotica, which became a major success and helped give the musical genre its name. All of this borrowed Tiki atmosphere had very little to do with any actual South Pacific Islander culture. Some elements may have been based on genuine Pacific art or traditions, but most were heavily altered, taken completely out of context, or simply invented by American designers and artists. Nobody really believed the American Tiki culture was authentic Polynesia, but they loved fueling their imagination with the island trappings. They loved to go there just as an escape. And by the early 1960s, America got so good at building that fantasy that the imaginary version of the South Pacific became a culture of its own. Future evolutions of Tiki culture borrowed from the previous American fabricated kitsch of it all, and because of this, Tiki culture has always dodged any serious criticisms of cultural appropriation, because modern Tiki culture draws from a fictional aesthetic and not any real tradition, religion, or culture. Part 5. What's old is new again. By the late 1960s, America's love affair with Tiki was beginning to cool off. The culture that had once seemed exotic and sophisticated was starting to look old-fashioned to a younger generation. The Vietnam War changed the way many Americans viewed Asia and the Pacific, while the counterculture was developing its own ideas about freedom, travel, sexuality, and alternative living. Young Americans no longer needed to visit an imaginary island to break the rules. They were doing it for real. By the 1970s, the big Polynesian restaurants that had once seemed mysterious and glamorous were beginning to feel like relics from the parents' generation. Some survived for decades, but others slowly disappeared as tastes and fashions changed. Tiki had become kitsch, but kitsch has a strange habit of coming back. By the 1990s, a new generation of collectors, artists, bartenders, musicians, and mid-century modern enthusiasts began looking at what remained and realizing how much had been lost. People started collecting old Tiki mugs, menus, artwork, and carvings. Exotica albums by Martin Denny, Les Baxter, and Arthur Lyman were rediscovered by listeners who had never heard them the first time around. Many of the original tiki drink recipes had disappeared along with the restaurants that had created them, but then a writer named Jeff Barry, better known as Beach Bum Barry, set out to track down some retired bartenders, study the old menus and recipes, and reconstruct many of those forgotten drinks from the golden age of tiki. New tiki bars began appearing with the same obsessive attention to atmosphere that had defined the great establishments of the 50s and 60s. Artists started to carve tikis again, craftsmen built elaborate bamboo interiors. Collectors created home bars filled with vintage mugs and lava lamps, carvings, records, and other mid-century memorabilia. Entire communities have formed around tiki culture. Events such as Tiki Oasis, which started in California in 2001, have grown into large gatherings featuring music, cocktails, art, fashion, vendors, and people who share a fascination with the strange world of American tiki. Our understanding of tiki has also changed. There's much more awareness today that classic American tiki freely borrowed and often distorted imagery from many different Pacific cultures. Modern tiki artists and establishments continue figuring out how to preserve the fun, fantasy, and history of tiki culture while treating the real cultures that inspire it with greater knowledge and respect. Still, nearly a century after Don Beach opened his little bar in Hollywood, the basic appeal of tiki remains. For a couple of hours, the outside world can stay outside. And maybe that's why tiki never really died, because the real product was always escape. Every generation has simply found its own reasons for wanting it. Tiki culture mixes island themes with Hollywood fantasy, blends it with cocktails and music, romance, and imagination to help create places that never actually existed on any map. There's something deeply human in the desire to catch a glimpse of another way of life and bring a little bit of that home. Most of us will never abandon everything and disappear onto a tropical island. I mean, I might, but most of us won't. But we might build a bar in the basement, light some bamboo torches in the backyard, put on an old Martin Denny record and pour something dangerously strong into a over-the-top ceramic mug and just escape for a little while. This is the enduring secret of tiki culture. The destination might always be imaginary, but the feelings of escape are real. Thank you sincerely for exploring tiki culture, cargo cults, and mid-century escapism with me. Subscribe or follow this show now so together we can meet here next time and explore the deepest stories of weird culture, UFOs, aliens, hauntings, cryptids, conspiracy theories, and unsolved mysteries. I am so happy to have you as part of the Renegade Files crew. You can find all things Renegade Files at therenegadefiles.com. Your one-stop shop for merchandise, Patreon bonus episodes that support the show, links to the show on your favorite apps, and every episode archived with a free player. All of that at therenegadefiles.com. Until our next adventure, I'm your host, Lex Gordon. Stay wild, island child.
Land of enchantment, intrigue, and mystery, hoping someday to return to this paradise, to walk again amongst the giant tiki gods, who stand majestically guarding the secrets of the past. We say aloha.